Hello, my name is Matt Maran. I am a wildlife photographer living in London, England, where I'm recording this show from right now in my garden studio where I live in North London. And first of all, I'd just like to say a big thanks to the photography show for pulling this together. It's been a nightmare of a year, really. It's such a shame that the show didn't go ahead, but I'm sure it's been no end of work pulling them together virtually. So that's great. Also, I'd like to say a big thanks to Lumix for providing the platform for us to be able to share our work. It's so expected these days, with photographers showing behind the scenes, what they get up to, how they get the images they do, the gear they use, the techniques they use. And I'll certainly be sharing a lot of my techniques and ideas and creative thought processes in this presentation. So I better crack on. We've got limited time. So the first few shots I've got here were all shots taken on film back in the early 2000s. And we have to remember the quality of film was really, really good before the digital revolution. Very smooth images on the best slide film available. And I was a photographer that, well, growing up in a city and living in London, I always wanted to get out. You know, my idea of wilderness was not here in a city, which is funny now that I've come full circle and actually most of my photography is in the city. But in the beginning, when I was younger, it was all about just wanting to go to exotic locations and see and photograph exotic wildlife. And I very much used photography as an excuse to visit some of these places. So I was going out. This first picture of a pygmy loris. This is in fact a baby pygmy loris. So it's one of the smallest and, in my opinion, cutest primates in the world. This was shot in a semi-wild enclosure in Vietnam, where they were doing a lot of work rehabilitating these animals. You can see for good reason they get caught up in the pet trade. I really enjoyed photographing primates in my early career. They're so like us, all the different behavior characteristics, even their expressions, like this spider monkey here taken in Bolivia. I was shooting Hanuman langurs leaping from trees in India, spending time in India, and I was lucky enough to see tigers. But at this stage, I was traveling a lot. I was not really spending too long in each area. And this was over a long period. I'd spend a lot of time working when I was younger, doing different jobs, saving up money to buy gear, to go on trips. And it was great. It was a really great lifestyle. I feel like I got some good pictures, but I quickly learned that to get really, really good pictures, and you needed to get under the skin of the place. But I wasn't complaining. I had a lot to learn, and I was still having great fun experiencing and traveling and seeing different cultures, as well as experiencing all the animals and the beautiful landscapes. Then in 2005, I got a sort of mini break. This image was awarded in the European Wildlife Photographer of the Year competition. In the landscape category, it was highly commended. This shot was taken in the center of Bolivia on the Altiplano, which is really high landscape, very flat, but almost this moon-like landscape and dotted with soda lakes and beautiful mountains. I had some great advice from the manager of my current picture library, Nature Picture Library, who I've been with for the past 15 years. Early on, she gave me some really good advice. I actually tried getting in there 2 times before I was accepted. You need a really good, strong portfolio of work. And she said to me, to get really, really good pictures, you have to focus on one animal or one area, and become a specialist and do it in a way that hasn't been done before, or choose an animal that hasn't really been photographed well before. So on a trip to North America, I visited Vancouver Island. I actually hadn't heard of Vancouver Island before I went there. Not many people had, but it's this huge island. It just sits off the west coast of British Columbia, about an hour-and-a-half ferry ride from Vancouver. And I traveled across to the west coast and spent about 4 years photographing there. I set about shooting all the landscapes and the surrounding wildlife. I was lucky enough to do some aerial photography. This is a shot of the Broken Group Islands. It's part of the Pacific Rim National Park on the west coast, and it's a group of about 100 islands dotted around in this huge bay called Berkeley Sound. And then in the waters, there's humpback whales lunge feeding and breaching, killer whales coming around about once a month, hunting in gangs, looking for seals. So, when the killer whales came around, there was a real buzz in the community. And in this picture, I was really lucky. 2 huge bull males swam right past our boat. So I just was relentless, going out on boats every day, capturing all the different wildlife using different lenses. This is around the time I started using wide angle lenses. You know, if you're lucky enough to get close to animals, a wide angle lens is just absolutely brilliant to show the animal in its environment. I was gathering all this great content. There wasn't really much published about this area, which I found surprising. And it resulted in my first book, Vancouver Island, Berkeley to Claycourt, which I published nearly 10 years ago now. So then I had to ask myself, what next? I bought the place where I live now with my partner in Tottenham in North London. So the funds had dried up for exotic foreign trips. So, you know, I had to turn and look locally, which is really quite poignant now during a pandemic where everybody's having to look local now that we can't travel, which is maybe not such a bad thing. So I live around about 20-minute drive from Hampstead Heath. It's a beautiful ancient park in North London. It's about 800 acres and there is spectacular stuff to be found in there, old growth trees. You know, I started to learn that storytelling with photography was really, really important, and not just about the wildlife and the landscapes, but also about the people and how they connect, how they thrive. You know, you have so many different people visiting this place for many different reasons. You have runners, dog walkers, hikers, and this lovely lady called May, who's nearly 90 now. She still walks every day on the heath, and she's developed this call that birds have come accustomed to. She feeds them in the wintertime, and this nice robin came right down and fed directly from her hand. It's also a classic place for a British picnic. You know, I really wanted to tell the story in a different way and just put as much effort as I could into getting engaging and captivating pictures. Here's a shot of me in one of the swimming ponds. There are 3 swimming ponds on the heath, and I got up to my neck in my wetsuit. I wanted to get low angled shots of a family of great crested grebes. This is one of my favorite shots of a swimmer with a great crested grebe and its chick in the foreground. And this was published in BBC Wildlife back in 2016 as part of a photo story, my first photo story in the magazine. And this is where I really started to get fascinated with urban wildlife and the story of how we can live together with these animals and how they adapt. And I really like this picture. It was kind of like the tables were turned, the wildlife was watching the people, and so often I'd be photographing kestrels. They'd be perched up in a tree and people would just walk underneath, blissfully ignorant that there was this beautiful raptor just above them, either on their phone or having conversations with their friends. And showing that connection between the city and green spaces. Hampstead Heath is just 5 kilometres from the city centre, and here you have the Shard, probably now one of the most iconic buildings on the London skyline, and a kestrel nicely perched on a beautiful sunrise on a cool February morning. So many different bird species visit the heath, winter migrants. Here you've got some black-headed gulls, and I really started to experiment again using wide angle, using flash to create some drama, create some movement in the pictures. And all of these images, again, led to my second book. I really enjoy publishing books. I think it's just a great way of telling stories, working with layouts. The editing process becomes really important. Learning to edit your work extremely tightly is some of the best advice I've been given. You know, the more ruthless you are with editing your work, the better your body of work will be. You know, don't show someone 50 pictures, edit those down into 10, and you will have a more cohesive, stronger body of work. So my second book, Hampstead Heath, London's Countryside, was published in 2016. And, you know, the storytelling style of photography really continued for me. I think in the early days, I was kind of obsessed with just trying to get, you know, award-winning shots. But actually, I think what's more important is to set yourself projects. I think you're going to have a much better chance of, you know, getting your work published or getting in competitions if you're out there telling stories with your work. A couple of years ago, I worked with a landowner in East Devon. We produced my third book. And here I've just pulled out a small story about some citizen science work where I've documented over a few days a bird ringer, capturing these birds in these mist nets. And just to give you a kind of idea of the sort of range of shots that I'm thinking of, showing this person at work, getting nice close-up details. This bird ringer would capture whitethroats, reed warblers, chiffchaffs, note down all the information, sex, weight, general health, and it would all be uploaded to the British Trust of Ornithology. It was a real conservation in action style piece. With this information, we're able to go to a landowner and say, look, populations need increasing. Can we plant more reed beds, along this stretch of river? So getting involved in that kind of work and using your photography as a tool to be able to communicate what's going on, I really, really enjoyed. And it felt like, you're contributing to really important conservation work. Going back to the advice that I got from Helen of shooting one area or one subject, an animal I've always been fascinated with, particularly since I was a kid, was growing up in the streets of London and seeing urban foxes. Now, I know there's some great work about urban foxes. There's some really good photographers out there who I watch and admire, but I thought this is a great opportunity for me. I live in an area now where just 10 minutes walk from my house, there's an allotment where I have a veg patch, and that's also where a family of foxes live. And so I spent the last 4 years almost exclusively photographing foxes. And it was a really big challenge for me. I'd never really consistently used flash with my work. And of course, shooting these animals at night is very necessary. So I basically did a crash course in how to set up flashes, how to sync them, how to use them wirelessly, how to control the power, and, made a lot of mistakes in the process, which of course is really important. But I think, shooting an urban fox and trying to light it naturally has been very, very hard, extremely frustrating, but you do get rewards. And it is that same old thing about going back over and over again, learning over and over again from your mistakes. And at the end of it, if you keep persisting, you will get a really good body of work. So here are some of my favorite shots taken at night. Using flash, I have it set at a very low power. Two things really. One, that you just don't completely blitz the animal. And the other thing is that the idea is that you want it to look natural. You want the subject to look like it's been lit naturally. So over the past 4 years, I've been building up this huge body of work, really exclusively from one area. It's also an incredibly low carbon footprint project. I can walk there in 10 minutes from my house. And, when I lock myself into this allotment, and especially when no one's around, it feels like I'm in my own mini Fox National Park. So the urban fox is just a fascinating animal for me. This is an animal that's been persecuted its whole existence, but has managed to survive, living amongst us in our towns and cities. In London, around, we have 8 million people here, but foxes still manage to find homes, to bring up young, to find enough food and water, and they're so agile, they can disappear in a flash. And even though I've been lucky enough to have access to this one vixen over the past 4 years, it's still been hugely challenging trying to get the images that I've got in my head actually on my camera. And spending a lot of time with one animal, you start getting picky and choosy, and you want to get creative and inventive with the kind of photography you're doing. I set up a camera on a tripod, and I was shooting these images remotely, using a twin flash setup. There are these water troughs all along the allotment for the plot holders to water their veg, and the foxes were using them, particularly in the summer, a lot as their water source. They jump up on their hind legs and start drinking. And to show this kind of behavior, I had to go to these sorts of lengths to get close and to get these intimate portraits. And so over the last few years, I've been shooting a lot more video. I think it's one of the things that stills photographers now can't ignore. It's expected. Particularly when we're doing presentations like this, showing behind the scenes footage. I've actually produced 3 short films about my work on the allotment, which you can view on my website. Doing both stills and video, you end up telling a story in a much more holistic way. Of course, my primary concern will always be stills. I'm a stills photographer at heart, but there are moments in film like this little fox cub appearing for the first time that you just cannot quite capture in the same way with stills. So this year, I was thrilled to get my second picture in the Wildlife Photographer of the Year competition. It's just been announced. This was a shot that I took last year, and one of the best things that I've ever seen. It was an incredible moment. This fox just flew out of the bushes with a rat in its mouth, and the rat was just huge. And then this battle took place where all the siblings were trying to get a piece of the rat. They were tossing it in the air, playing with it in a very cat-like way. It was quite extraordinary. So over the last year, I've been using the Lumix S1 camera, and it's just been magnificent for me on this project, particularly shooting in low light. You know, I talked already about the challenges that photographers have in trying to get those fast enough shutter speeds to freeze the action. But also that compromise, you know, the higher you go with those ISOs, the more grainy your picture is going to appear. And so I've been really impressed. And actually quite early on, I got one of my favorite shots. I was using the 70-200 lens with this, and I've just put the settings in here just so you can see the capabilities of this camera at high ISOs. So this is one of the things when I was talking with Lumix that I was really concerned about. So I set this camera, it was quite low light. The sun had gone down, there's just ambient light left, and set it at 6400 ISO. And this is a full frame picture. I've done no cropping. I just thought it'd be interesting to show you how smooth this picture is at such a high ISO. This is it at 50%. And then again at 100%, virtually no grain whatsoever. So then I took it out into the streets. This is a shot I got of a young cub, and there was virtually no light. I've brightened this up a tiny bit. In Photoshop, you can see some street lights in the background, but this was taken at 10,000 ISO. And, you know, this is perfectly adequate. You know, my picture library would take this. It's the quality of the picture is very, very smooth. Lovely full frame picture of a fox late at night. Also, what's working for me really well is the dual stabilization. I mean, that's something that's just incredible. I've managed to shoot handheld shots of almost up to 2 seconds and they still remain sharp. This is another one, 3200 ISO at 100%. And you can just see, even in those shadow areas, the smoothness and the quality of the pictures. Another shot here, one of my favorite scenes, a London bus going past, and this was a dog fox and a vixen hanging out together. This was shot at 2000 ISO, and again up close, the detail in there, again the shadow areas, that noise is really held, and it's just a fantastic improvement when it comes to low light photography. In the area where I've been photographing these foxes, there's some brilliant street art, and my partner found this wonderful stencil of this fox on a wall close to where the allotment is, and I thought, wow, wouldn't it be great to get a live fox stood right next to this stencil. So foxes are creatures of habits. They do similar routes when they're patrolling their territory. And I managed to get one, and again, that kind of hopeful shot of a fox walking past. There was something that just didn't feel quite right about it. It didn't have the impact that I wanted. This one shows the fox is just monkeying with me, not really going where I wanted, but had quite good comedy element to it. And then this one was one of my favorites. I liked that the eye line of the stencil fox was looking directly down at the fox kind of hiding behind the wall. And then as it got lighter, this was, you know, I first started off doing this in the winter using flash setup. I then was able to use natural light, but there just wasn't enough. You can see the image is a bit blurred. This was really late. I have lightened this quite a bit in Photoshop. Didn't really quite work out. And, but as always is the case in nature photography, perseverance does pay off. And about 6 months after I had the idea to get this shot, I got this one. So this was taken in April, and I saw the fox coming towards the stencil. I ran ahead of it, and because I'd done so much prep, I knew the settings that I needed. I used the 70-200 on this and fired off 5 or 6 frames, and this was the perfect one, right in between. The leg position was perfect. It made me realize what a good job Stewie, the artist who did this stencil, did of capturing the spirit of the fox. The eye line was perfect. And this was my other image that was awarded in the Lumix People's Choice Award in the Wildlife Photographer of the Year 2 years ago. So I'm going to finish off with a nice sequence of a fox bedding down for the night, high up in some trellis, backing onto this nice Victorian terrace. And I want to thank you very much for listening to my talk. If you want to connect with me, I'm most active on Instagram. We're at Matt Maran Photo. My website is matthewmaran.com. I also host a podcast where I interview some of the best photographers, conservationists, and filmmakers. So please check that out. And thanks so much again for listening.